The morning light came gently, almost too gently for a world that had already burned once. It slipped through the wide green leaves of the newly rebuilt gourd trellis, scattering soft shadows across the damp earth below. The garden had come back to life faster than anyone expected. Rows of spinach stretched quietly across the soil, mustard greens swayed under the breeze, and the young gourds hung like fragile promises, still learning how to exist. Everything felt peaceful, too peaceful. Quan stood at the far end of the garden, his back slightly bent as he drove a shovel deep into the soil. The sound of metal cutting through earth echoed in a steady rhythm. Again, and again, and again. He had been working since before sunrise. No one asked him to, no one told him to. But ever since that day at the clinic, something inside him had changed. Not dramatically, not loudly, just permanently. A child. The thought alone was enough to make his chest tighten in a way no business deal, no loss, no fire had ever managed to do. A child. His child. And suddenly everything else felt small. He pressed the shovel harder into the ground, his jaw tightening as sweat rolled down from his temples. "I have to be faster," he muttered under his breath, not even realizing he had spoken. Faster, stronger, better. Because now it was no longer just about surviving. It was about protecting. A soft laugh drifted across the garden. Quan stopped. He didn't need to turn to know where it came from. Still, he did. Under the gourd trellis, Tieu Lac sat on a low bamboo stool, surrounded by a small group of children. The sunlight filtered through the leaves above her, painting her face in warm, shifting patterns. She looked different. Not weaker, not fragile, but softer. There was something in her eyes now, a quiet glow that hadn't been there before. "Say it again," she said gently. The children leaned forward eagerly. "The plant grows from a seed." "The plant grows from a seed," they repeated, their voices uneven but full of excitement. Tieu Lac smiled, her hand instinctively resting on her belly. A simple gesture, but to Quan it felt heavier than anything else in the world. He exhaled slowly, the tension in his shoulders easing just a little. That was the reason he worked like this. That moment, that quiet, fragile happiness. He turned away again and lifted the shovel. If he had to trade every ounce of strength in his body to keep that smile on her face, he would, without hesitation. By noon, the heat had settled heavily over the village. Quan carried 2 large baskets of vegetables across the garden, his arms trembling slightly from the weight. He set them down near the porch and wiped his forehead with the back of his hand. "You didn't take a break again, did you?" Tieu Lac's voice came from behind him. He turned. She was standing there now, one hand lightly holding the wooden pillar of the unfinished house. There was a softness in her expression, but also concern. "I'm fine," Quan replied quickly, too quickly. Her eyes narrowed just a little. "You've been saying that every day." He forced a small smile. "And I've been fine every day." She stepped closer, slowly, carefully, as if every movement now carried more weight than before. "That doesn't mean you should push yourself like this." Her voice was gentle, but there was something firm underneath. Quan looked at her for a moment. Then, without warning, he reached out and placed his hand over hers and guided it gently to her belly. "You need to rest," he said quietly. "Not me." The words were simple, but the way he said them, it wasn't a suggestion, it was a decision. Tieu Lac's breath caught slightly. She knew that tone. She had heard it before. Back when he was still the CEO everyone feared. Back when his decisions could move entire companies. Now, that same determination was focused on something much smaller and infinitely more important. She lowered her gaze, her fingers curling slightly against his hand. "And what about you?" Quan didn't answer immediately. Instead, he let out a slow breath and looked toward the garden. "I'll be fine." A pause, then softer. "I have to be." The days passed like that. Quiet, steady, almost too steady. Every morning, Quan worked from before sunrise until the heat forced him to stop. Every afternoon, Tieu Lac sat under the trellis, teaching the children simple lessons, reading, counting, small stories about the land and the seasons. The village adjusted around them. The women made sure Tieu Lac never lifted anything heavy. The men began helping Quan expand the garden. Everything felt like it was slowly falling into place, like life was finally giving them something back. Until the afternoon, everything shifted. It happened without warning, just like the fire. The sun was beginning to lower when a figure appeared at the far end of the dirt road leading into the village. At first, no one paid attention. People came and went all the time, but this figure didn't move like the others. He staggered, his steps uneven, his shoulders hunched, as if something invisible was pressing down on him from above. Quan noticed first. His instincts had always been sharp. Even here in this quiet place, they hadn't faded. They had only changed. He straightened slowly, his eyes narrowing as he watched the man approach. Something wasn't right. Under the trellis, Tieu Lac was helping little Mai trace letters in the dirt. "Like this," she said softly, guiding the child's hand. But then, a shadow fell across the ground. She looked up and froze. "An?" Her voice was barely above a whisper. The man standing at the edge of the yard lifted his head. His face was thinner than she remembered, his eyes sunken. But there was no mistaking him. Her brother. For a moment, no one moved. Even the children fell silent, sensing something they couldn't understand. Then he forced a smile, a weak one. "Lac," his voice cracked slightly. "Long time." He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. Everything about him already said enough. Tieu Lac stood up slowly. Her heart was beating faster now. Not from joy, not from surprise, from something else, something heavier. "What happened to you?" she asked quietly. He shrugged, a careless gesture, but it didn't match the tension in his shoulders. "Nothing." A lie, an obvious one. Quan stepped forward, placing himself just slightly between Tieu Lac and the man. Not aggressively, not obviously, but enough. "Come inside," Tieu Lac said after a moment, her voice softer now. Still, family, no matter what. That evening, the air inside the small house felt different, heavier. The simple dinner sat untouched for a while. No one seemed eager to speak first. Until finally, "I ran into some trouble." Her brother broke the silence. His fingers tapped lightly against the wooden table. A nervous rhythm. Quan didn't respond. He just watched, waiting, listening. "I lost some money." Another lie, or rather, a half-truth. Tieu Lac's grip tightened slightly around her bowl. "How much?" He didn't answer immediately. His gaze shifted, avoiding hers. Then, "A lot." The words came out quietly, but they landed hard. Silence. Then, "I need help." He looked directly at Quan this time, not at his sister, at Quan. "Help me pay it." There it was, the real reason. Tieu Lac shook her head immediately. "No." The word came out faster than she expected, stronger too. "We don't have anything left." Her voice trembled slightly, but she didn't take it back. "The house burned. Everything is gone. We're still rebuilding. I'll die if I don't pay them." He slammed his hand lightly against the table, not loud, but desperate. "They won't let me go." Quan finally spoke, his voice calm, too calm. "How much do you owe?" A number was said, low, almost swallowed, but enough. Enough to understand, enough to know. This wasn't something small. Quan leaned back slightly. His expression didn't change, but something in his eyes hardened. "That's not a debt," he said quietly. "That's a pit." A pause. Then, "And you're asking us to jump in with you?" The room went still. Tieu Lac looked down. Her brother's face twisted slightly. "You think I want this?" he snapped. "You think I came here for fun?" "No," Quan replied. "I think you came here because you have nowhere else to go." The truth. Plain, sharp, uncomfortable. "And you're right," Quan continued. "You don't." Another pause, then colder. "But that doesn't mean we become your escape." Tieu Lac closed her eyes briefly. She knew, she understood, but it still hurt, because no matter what, he was still her brother. That night, the air outside felt colder than usual, even though the season hadn't changed, even though the village was still quiet, even though the garden still stood. Something had shifted, and somewhere in the distance, trouble was already on its way. The night passed, but it did not bring peace. It only made everything quieter, and sometimes, silence was more dangerous than noise. Quan did not sleep. He lay beside Tieu Lac under the dim light of the oil lamp, his arm resting lightly across her waist, careful, always careful, not to put any pressure on her. Her breathing was soft, steady, but not deep. Even in sleep, she wasn't truly at rest. Neither of them were. Between them, something unspoken lingered. Her brother, the dead, the look in his eyes. Quan stared at the ceiling, his jaw tight. He had seen that look before, not in villages, not in quiet places like this, but in the city, in back rooms, in deals that ended badly. That kind of fear never came alone. Outside, the wind moved through the bamboo trees, creating a soft, rustling sound, almost like whispers, almost like warnings. Morning came slower than usual. The sky was pale, the air heavier. Even the garden felt different. Quan stepped outside early, as always, but today his movements were sharper, faster, less patient. He worked the soil like he was trying to bury something deeper than seeds. Behind him, under the gourd trellis, Tieu Lac sat quietly. The children were there, as usual, but the laughter was softer today, less carefree. "Auntie, what's wrong?" Little Mai asked, tilting her head. Tieu Lac blinked, then forced a small smile. Nothing. But her hand rested on her belly again, not gently this time, protectively. From the edge of the yard, her brother watched. His eyes moved constantly, left, right, back toward the road. He hadn't touched breakfast, hadn't said much, but his silence was louder than anything he could have said. Quan noticed. Of course he did. He always noticed. He walked over slowly, stopping a few steps away. "They're coming, aren't they?" No accusation, no anger, just certainty. The man flinched, then looked away. "I don't know." Another lie, a weaker one this time. Quan exhaled, long, slow. "You should have left before sunrise." The words landed heavier than they sounded. Her brother's head snapped up. "You want me to run? I want you to stop dragging this place into your mess." For a second, something dark flickered in the man's eyes. Pride, shame, fear, all mixed together. "You think I don't know that?" he muttered. "But where do I go?" No answer came, because there wasn't one. And then, the sound. A motor. Loud. Too loud for a place like this. Every head turned toward the road. The children went silent. The air tightened. 3 motorbikes. They didn't slow down. They didn't hesitate. They rode straight into the yard, tires grinding against the dirt, stopping just a few meters from the house. Dust rose into the air, catching the morning light. And then, stillness. The men didn't get off immediately. They just sat there for a moment, looking, scanning, like predators. Then one of them smirked. "Well, look at this." His voice was low, mocking. Found you. Tieu Lac's heart dropped. Her fingers tightened around the edge of the stool. Behind her, one of the children whimpered softly. Quan stepped forward. Not fast, not aggressive, but firm. Every step measured. He placed himself between the men and the house. Turn around, he said calmly. You're not welcome here. The man laughed, a short, sharp sound. Not welcome? He stepped off the bike slowly, stretching his arms like he had all the time in the world. You think this is about welcome? Two others got off behind him. Their boots hit the ground heavily. Intentional. We're here for him. He pointed toward the house. Bring him out. Inside, Tieu Lac's brother stood frozen, his breathing shallow, his hands shaking. Tieu Lac stepped forward instinctively. No! Her voice trembled, but she didn't move back. He's my brother. The man tilted his head, then smiled. That's unfortunate. Quan's voice cut through the moment. You have your answer. Leave. The air shifted, just slightly, but enough. The man's smile faded, his eyes hardened. Careful. He took a step closer. You don't know who you're talking to. Quan didn't move, didn't blink. I don't need to. A pause, longer this time. Then, the man clicked his tongue. All right. He rolled his shoulders. Let's do this the easy way. He gestured. One of the men walked toward the house. Quan moved instantly. He grabbed the man's arm mid-step. Hard. Don't. One word. Sharp. The tension snapped. The man yanked his arm back. Touch me again. Then don't step inside. Quan's voice dropped lower. More dangerous. For a second, everything hung on a thread. Then the leader raised a hand, stopping his men. Relax. He smirked again. No need to rush. His gaze shifted toward Tieu Lac, slowly, deliberately. Maybe we should talk to the family instead. Tieu Lac stiffened. Quan's expression darkened. You owe money, the man continued casually, as if discussing the weather. Money we don't like to lose. We don't have it, Tieu Lac said. This time her voice steadier. The man nodded slowly. Of course you don't. His eyes flicked around the yard, the garden, the house, the people. But you have something. Before anyone could react, he stepped forward, too fast. Quan moved to block him, but in that split second, another man pushed past from the side. Everything happened at once. Voices, shouts, movement. Stop! Tieu Lac stepped forward. Instinct, fear, desperation. A hand shoved hard. She lost her footing. Time slowed. Her heels slipped against the loose dirt. Her body tilted backward. Her hand reached out, but found nothing. Lac! Quan's voice broke. And then, she fell. The sound wasn't loud, but it echoed. Her body hit the ground. Her arms instinctively wrapped around her stomach. Silence for half a second. Then, a sharp inhale, a tremble. It hurts. Her voice was barely there. Quan froze, then moved, faster than he ever had. He dropped to his knees beside her. Lac, look at me. His hands hovered, afraid to touch, afraid not to. Her face had gone pale, too pale. And then, a stain, dark, spreading slowly beneath her. Quan's world shattered. No! The word came out broken. He gathered her into his arms. Careful, too careful. Stay with me. His voice shook. Stay with me. Around them, everything blurred. Voices turned distant, movements meaningless. All that mattered was the woman in his arms and the life she carried. Get the bike, he shouted. This time, there was no calm, no control, only fear. The kind that tore through everything. The ride to the hospital felt endless. And yet, it passed in a blur. The motorbike roared through the narrow dirt road, its engine pushed far beyond what it was meant to handle. Dust rose behind them in thick clouds, swallowed quickly by the morning light. Quan didn't slow down. He couldn't. Tieu Lac, stay with me. His voice was raw, broken, not the voice of a man in control, but of someone losing it. She was in his arms, too still, too quiet, her fingers clutched weakly at his shirt, her breath uneven, shallow, fading in and out like a fragile thread about to snap. Quan, her voice trembled, don't let anything happen to the baby. His chest tightened violently. No! The word came out instantly, firm, desperate. I won't! But even as he said it, his hands trembled. The road ahead blurred. Every bump felt like a blade cutting through his nerves. Every second, a lifetime. Look at me, he said again, louder this time. Stay awake. Don't close your eyes. She tried, she really did. But the pain, it was pulling her down. I'm scared. Her voice was barely there now. Quan's vision shook. For the first time in years, he felt powerless. You're not allowed to be scared, he said, his voice cracking, because I'm here. A lie, a desperate one. Because in that moment, he didn't even believe himself. The hospital gate appeared ahead, too far, still too far. Hold on, he whispered, almost pleading. And then they arrived. The bike didn't even stop properly. Quan jumped off before it fully slowed, nearly losing balance as he carried her inside. Doctor! His voice echoed through the hallway, loud, sharp, terrified. Nurses rushed forward. What happened? Pregnant. She fell, bleeding. The words came out broken, incomplete, but enough. Emergency room, now! The doors opened, then slammed shut, and just like that, she was gone. Quan stood there, frozen, his arms still slightly raised, as if he hadn't fully let go of her yet. The hallway was bright, too bright. The smell of disinfectant filled the air, cold, unforgiving. His hands, still stained with her blood. Slowly, he looked down at them, his fingers curled, then tightened. No. He slammed his fist against the wall. Once, hard. A nurse flinched nearby, but he didn't care, because in that moment, there was only one thought in his head. If something happens to her, he couldn't finish it. Minutes passed, or hours. He couldn't tell. The clock on the wall ticked, each second dragging like a weight. Memories flooded in, uninvited, unstoppable. Her laughter under the gourd trellis, the way she held her belly, the way she smiled when the children called her name. And then, her voice earlier that morning, soft, worried. You should rest too. His chest tightened again. He should have known. He should have stopped it. He should have... The door opened. Quan snapped up instantly. The doctor stepped out. Her expression, serious, too serious. He walked toward her, fast, almost stumbling. My wife! His voice was hoarse. The baby. The doctor looked at him for a moment. Not long, but enough. She's stable, for now. The words hit, but didn't settle. And the baby? A pause, then. She's had a severe shock. We're doing everything we can. Everything we can. Not a promise, not certainty, just possibility. Quan's heart dropped. She's in critical condition, the doctor continued, especially the pregnancy. If we can't stabilize it, she didn't finish. She didn't need to. Quan's hands clenched. His jaw tightened so hard it hurt. What do you need, he asked. No hesitation, no doubt. The doctor blinked slightly. Whatever it is, I'll do it. A beat. Then she nodded. We need time. Time. The one thing he didn't have. The one thing he couldn't control. I want to see her. Not yet. The answer came gently, but firmly. Quan stood there, breathing slowly, trying and failing to stay still. And then something shifted. His expression changed. The fear, didn't disappear. It turned into something else, something darker, colder, more dangerous. He turned without another word and walked out of the hospital. The sun outside was harsh, blinding, but he didn't slow down. The engine roared again. This time, he wasn't running. He was going back. Back to the place where everything broke. Back to the people who caused it. The village was quieter now. Too quiet. The moment Quan arrived, everyone felt it. He didn't look like the same man. There was no warmth in his eyes, no softness, no patience. Only one thing: rage. The men were still there, waiting, talking among themselves like nothing had happened. They turned when they heard the bike. One of them smirked. Well, he's back. Quan walked straight toward them, step by step, no hesitation. You heard her. 4 words, low, deadly. The leader tilted his head. Oh, that was her fault. She stepped in. The air dropped. Quan didn't respond. He just moved, fast. His fists connected before anyone could react. The man staggered back, shocked. Everything exploded. Shouting, movement, chaos. But this time, Quan didn't hold back. Every hit, precise, controlled, relentless, not wild, not messy, calculated. Because this wasn't just anger, this was protection. You think this is over? The leader spat, blood at the corner of his mouth. You think you can just walk away? Quan stepped closer. No. His voice was calm again, too calm. You walk away. A pause. Or you don't walk at all. Silence. The kind that settles after something breaks. And for the first time, they hesitated because they saw it. This wasn't a man they could push anymore. This wasn't someone they could threaten. This was someone who had nothing left to lose. And that was dangerous. Back at the hospital, the light above the emergency room flickered slightly. Inside, machines beeped, soft, unsteady. Tieu Lac lay there, still, pale. Her hand rested weakly over her belly, and somewhere between pain and silence, a fragile life hung on a thread. Quan stood outside once more, hours later. His hands were bruised, his knuckles torn, but he didn't feel any of it, because behind that door was everything. His wife, his child, his future. The doctor stepped out again. This time, her expression was harder to read. Quan didn't speak. He couldn't. So he waited. And then she said, "We've done everything we can." A pause long enough to stop a heart. The next few hours, her voice lowered, "We'll decide everything." Quan closed his eyes. For the first time, he prayed, not for success, not for control, just for a miracle.